In this video, I'm installing power folding mirrors on a 2023 Toyota RAV4 Prime SE. I bought this power folding mirror kit from CarTrimHome. See the description below for a link. They just came out with a new version of the kit that simplifies the install from the old version. The link says it's not for the Prime, but with a few modifications I was able to make it work for my Prime. Here's the driver's side of the kit, which includes the motorized mount, wiring harness, controller module with some Velcro, the switch cable, mirror adjustment cover, some zip ties, and the pick tool. The passenger side just contains a motorized mount, another controller with Velcro, a wiring harness, and some zip ties. I mostly took photos as it's hard to film while working with one hand. Let's get started. I started with the passenger side. As you can see here, my car currently has the original mirrors and I can fold them by hand. I started off by pulling up the outer edge of the white mirror cap by hand. There are some clips holding it in place and it should snap right out. Next, there are two screws that need to be removed here. Once I remove them, I move the upper plastic slightly out of the way enough to pull out the turn signal. There is a clip here that needs to be squeezed and pushed through the hole in the turn signal. After doing that, I removed the connector and the turn signal came right out. Next, I worked my way around the bottom to remove the rest of the black trim. There are some plastic clips holding it in place, so I had to be careful not to break them. I moved this last one next to the pivot point with the pick that came with the kit. Here's a picture of the lower trim piece removed. Next, I moved on to the door panels. I took a plastic trim removal tool and worked my way along the bottom of the door pull trim to pop it off. Don't use a screwdriver here as it can damage the plastic. Here you can see all the holes where the clips go. The next step is to remove the trim next to the handle and lock. I pried using my trim tool next to the lock and it popped right off. I now have access to 3 screws I need to remove to take off the door panel. You can see them here. Pay attention to the size of the screws. The one next to the lock is smaller than the other two. Before pulling off the door panel, I first had to remove the lock and window controls. I started by prying from the back with my trim removal tool. The clips popped right out and I slid the panel back. Here you can see the front clip. This clip needs to go in first when reinstalling. There are 2 connectors that need to be removed as well. Now the door panel can finally be removed. I started by working my way around the outside with my trim removal tool and prying the clips loose. After the bottom and sides are popped out, the panel can be taken off by pulling along the top edge. Before fully removing the panel, the cables for the lock and handle need to be removed. This is done by simply unclipping the white and green sleeves away from the door panel and then pulling the ball at the end of the cable up and out of their sockets. Pay attention to which cable goes into which spot. Here is the door with the panel removed. I had a few clips that stayed in the door and didn't come out with the panel, so I had to manually pull those out and put them back into the door panel. This is a little bit tricky to do the first time. Here you can see there are 3 circles on the clip. To pull these out, you need to get under the bottom circle and basically get the trim tool to squeeze the clip here while putting a little pressure on it to get it out. They slide back into the door panel between the first and second circles. Here's a close-up where you can see the gap between the second and third circles. There's a rubber gasket underneath that you'll need to make sure stays with the clip. These will likely break, so it's probably a good idea to have a few spares on hand. I didn't, so I just put them on the bottom clips with the brake facing down to minimize any chance of getting water into the door. Here's a photo with the location of all 10 clips. With the door panel out of the way, it's time to finally remove the mirror assembly from the car. I started by removing this screw holding this black panel in place. This can be done either with a Phillips head screwdriver or I believe a 10mm socket. Next, I stuck my plastic trim removal tool behind the black cover and pushed the clip inward while putting outward pressure to pry the panel out. Here's the back where you can see the 2 clips holding it in. I then removed the wiring harness from this clip and removed the connector. If you look in the opening, you can see the wiring harness is routed in front of the window track. This is important as it ensures it doesn't get in the way of the window opening. Next, I used a ratchet with a 10mm socket and an extension to remove these 3 nuts holding the mirror assembly. Be extremely careful here not to drop the nuts into the door. It might be helpful to hold a magnetic tray underneath to catch them if they fall. There is a plastic clip up here to stop the mirror from falling down, but it's still a good idea to support it from the other side just in case. Once I removed all 3 bolts, I had to press down on the plastic clip with my finger to free the mirror assembly from the door. After that, it pulls right out and the wiring harness follows. Now I'm working on my workbench with a soft pad under the mirror to prevent any scratching. I started by removing some connectors and screws. These two connectors are for the blind spot monitoring and the heating element. This connector has a clip holding it in place and came out easily, but I wasn't able to get the other one off easily, so I left it plugged in to avoid the risk of breaking anything. It's not a problem, we can work around this. I used the included pick to gently pry up this plastic piece with the wires going to it. These wires are for the mirror tilt controls. It helps to slide the wires out from the plastic clip holding them in place. I also removed the screw holding the mirror housing to the pivot mount. Finally, I removed these 4 screws. Be sure to stay organized as not all the screws are the same size. The mirror glass should now be free of the rest of the housing, but I left it where it was because of the heating connector I didn't remove. Next, I started working on the base of the mirror assembly. I took my plastic trim tool and pried off the rubber cover from the bottom. There's a red piece of tape covering up part of the cover, so it won't come completely off yet. Next, I pried off the plastic bottom half of the base. There are a few clips holding it in place, and they are very fragile. They will likely bend or break, so be extremely careful and gentle here. Following the wiring harness up the base through the bottom of the mirror assembly, you'll see that there are 3 screws holding it together. I used a torque screwdriver to remove these. I believe these were T25 if I remember correctly. Once these are out, the mirror should come right off the base. Next, I went back down to the rubber cover on the base and removed the red tape, careful not to rip it. We'll be reusing this later. Notice this pink line on the wiring harness. This lines up perfectly with the edge of the little sleeve on the rubber cover and will be important in properly aligning the wiring harness when we reassemble everything. The wiring connector is too thick to fit through the rubber cover and the mirror housing, but luckily Toyota made this easy to do by using a pretty cool connector. If you look closely, this is actually 2 connectors held together by a larger plastic housing. Each side of the mini connectors has a small tab locking it in place. This took some effort, but I was able to get my pick in there on the outside and in the center in between the mini connectors and free them from the outer portion holding them in place. Don't worry about which side is which, as they are different shapes and can only go in one way. The wires are different lengths to make it easy to offset them to slide them through the mirror housing. Great job, Toyota Engineering. The last step before we can pull the mirror mount off the housing is to remove this screw down here, again remembering to keep everything organized. Now the mount can pop right off. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the original mount next to the new mount. Right away you'll notice that the original mount is plastic while the new one is metal. You also have wires for the power folding on the new motorized mount where you don't on the original one. The motorized mount also comes with 5 screws pre-installed, which we'll be using in place of the corresponding original screws we removed. Here's the first one, and here are the other 4. These can be removed now. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the original screws with the new ones. These are the 5 new screws. I placed the new motorized mirror mount into the housing by aligning this metal nub with a corresponding clip in the housing and sliding it right in. There's a little spike down here that lines up at the bottom. Then I installed the 2 screws that hold the mount in place. Here we use one of the new screws that came with the kit, but up here I reused one of the original ones. Next, I routed the cables back through the hole in the new mount. I started with the motor wires first. One thing to note is the motor wires had an extra connector attached to the end of the connector, which added to the thickness. I didn't notice this until it was time to plug everything in, but I simply unplugged that extra connector later and continued. The motor wires have to go in before the original wiring harness because if you do it the other way around, the motor wires won't fit through the hole. It's a bit of a tight squeeze, but the wires will go in one at a time. After that, I reused these 4 screws and reattached the mirror glass to the mount. The plastic connector with the 4 wires snaps right back in, and the wires can be held in by the clip once again. Now the connector for the blind spot monitoring can go back in. This connector here is for the turn signal and will stay unplugged for now. Next, the wires need to go back through the base, following the same order as before. The motor wires come first, followed by the original harness. Next, I attach the base to the mount. This knob on the mount goes into this hole on the base, so the mount can only attach to the base one way. Once it was aligned, I used the 3 new screws that came with the kit to secure it down. Finally, the wires go through the rubber cover at the bottom of the base, and the cover should slide around the base screws. If the plastic safety clip slid out at any point, this needs to be pushed back in. The motor wire should be pulled through enough that it has decent length to work with, but not too tight that it puts strain on the wires at the top of the motor. This right here should be plenty. The pink line on the original wiring harness should line up with the end of the sleeve on the rubber base cover, and now the red tape we took off earlier can be put back on. Next, I snapped the bottom part of the base back in. After that, I reinserted the original wire mini connectors into the plastic holder to turn it back into a larger connector. I tugged on both sides to make sure they wouldn't slide back out. In case you forgot to remove this screw like I did, it needs to be removed now, and we'll use it to reattach the lower plastic trim on the mirror housing. This was a little bit tricky to get back in, and there are some clips that need to snap back into place. Next, I plugged the turn signal back in. The turn signal goes back in by pulling the top half of the plastic mirror housing back a bit and sliding the turn signal in. The turn signal should sit on top of the bottom half of the mirror housing, and the curve of the turn signal should line up with the curve of the mirror housing. After it's in, the top part of the mirror housing has a clip that snaps into a hole in the turn signal, along with a few alignment knobs that also go into the mirror mount and into the main mirror housing. After it's in, it's time to put that screw we just removed back in. This original screw also goes back in here. Here's everything reassembled except the mirror cap. Finally, I installed the mirror caps. I decided to upgrade and go with black ones I bought from Toyota. These snap right in. Next, I routed the wiring harness through the car. I didn't clean off the dirt around the holes, but now would be a good time to do so. I aligned the 3 bolts, the plastic clip, and the plastic nubs with their corresponding holes and pushed everything through. Before letting go of the mirror, it's a good idea to check and make sure the plastic clip is holding it in place and preventing it from falling. Back inside the car, I checked to make sure that both the original wiring harness and the motor wires were routed properly around the window track on the side closer to the front of the car, and made sure that they both came out through the opening in the door instead of being stuck inside. Next, I snugged up the bolts with my ratchet using my 10mm socket and extension, again being extremely careful not to drop any bolts into the abyss. One final check on the outside and the mirror is looking nice and secure. I reinstalled the plastic cover, routing the wires up through the opening at the top. After the side clips were in and the wires were in the correct position, the screw went back on. Next, I tucked the wires into the clip to hold them in place. Finally, I started connecting everything. Previously, I mentioned that the motor wires came with an extra connector attached to them. This is where I pulled it off and threw it out. Now I was able to plug the wires in. The rest of the connectors are pretty straightforward. The harness that came with the kit attaches in line between the original mirror connector and the car using these plugs. I was also able to slide the connector onto the plastic bracket clipped into the car door. Be mindful that this makes the wiring here a little bit tight, but it should still work. The last connector plugs into the control module, and then the Velcro can be used to stick the module to the door. Next, I reinstalled the door panel. I first reinstalled the lock and door handle cables by lining up the ball with the channel they go into, and then snapping the green and white sleeves into the plastic clips that hold them. The grease on both of those is a different color, making it easy to know which goes where in case you forget. Next, I aligned the door panel clips with their corresponding holes and pushed around the panel with my hand to lock them in place. A good reference point to line it up properly is up by the window. There's an indentation where the window track meets the door panel. Now that everything is secure, the 3 screws can go back into the door panel. The short one goes by the lock and handle, and the 2 longer ones go into the holes in the door pull. Next, the 2 connectors for the windows and locks need to be plugged back in, and the switch panel can be reattached. Start by sliding the front in first, and then working your way towards the back and popping the clips into place. The trim piece on the door pull can be reattached next, starting by sliding the back in and working your way forward and popping all the clips back in. Finally, the cover by the handle and lock can be reinstalled by sliding the front in and pressing down on the back. At this point, I took a break and finished up the next day. Because the switch and driver mirror have not yet been installed, the passenger side does not work yet. Also, for some reason, the passenger up and down tilt controls don't work until the driver's side is installed. The next day, I did the driver's side. Everything is the same as the passenger side until the part where you install the harness and switch. The controller module on the driver's side came with a sticker on the connector written in Chinese. I figured this looked important, so I looked up the translation and it said to install this connector last. Good to know. The main differences on the driver's side harness is that different things get plugged in. These 2 connectors are unplugged and used in line with the corresponding connectors on the new harness. The motor wires still connect the same way, but the original mirror harness plugs back into the original connector instead of through the new harness. The mirror switch connector now goes in line with the new harness as well. This can all look a bit daunting at first, but it gets less intimidating as you start connecting things. Double check and make sure you've connected all the connections. This 3-pin connector is for the mirror folding switch. I left it disconnected for now and taped it off for a few days since I had to figure out how to modify and install the new switch controls. I tested the power folding feature with locking and unlocking the car. Oh man, this is so sweet. I checked and made sure all the original features worked as well, like all the mirror adjustments, heating, and blind spot monitoring. At this point, I zip tied the wires and reassembled everything. I had to leave the wires a little more slack than expected since the new harness and placement of the controller module made it harder for the wires to reach the window and mirror controls. I also had to move the controller module back a little bit so the wires to the mirror and window controls would have more slack. Remember, there are two connectors for these controls. I drove the car without the power folding switch for a few days until I figured out what to do with the switch. Again, the RAV4 Prime uses a slightly different switch housing than the regular RAV4, so it needed to be modified in order to get it to work. I started by pulling off and unplugging the driver's side window and mirror controls. Back on the bench, I removed these three screws at the bottom of the panel. This allowed me to take out the window switches for easier access to the clips needed to remove the mirror adjustment switch. I gently pushed the thin end of my plastic trim removal tool to free these two clips holding the switch housing in place. I did the same on the other side. These clips are very fragile and will easily break. Once everything is out, we can focus on the window switch assembly. The top blank switch and the cover surrounding the tilt controls is one piece, held in by this tab here and these tabs along the side. One on either side. The way I got it off was by sticking my trim tool under this piece and pushing up a bit until it popped off this tab, then holding it with my finger and trying to get the sides loose. Next, I tried to install the flex cable provided in the kit, but it didn't fit. As you can see, it goes down too deep, and if you try to push it in all the way, it tilts either to the left or the right. This can't be right. So what I did was I 3D printed a small adapter to get this to fit properly. If you compare the left to the right side, notice how this vertical line sits flush when the adapter is in, and it's too low on this side without the adapter. Here everything is flush. Here's what the switch looks like when it's on the adapter, and here's what it looks like when it's all put together. Much better. I emailed CarTrimHome about this with a measurement of my adapter so they could hopefully make adjustments for the RAV4 Prime for future versions of this kit. I removed the adhesive backing from the double-sided tape from the flex cable and stuck it to the side of the housing, being careful to not bend the cable. I then snapped the plastic switch cover into place and tested the button movement to make sure the flex cable didn't get in the way. Finally, I stuck on some fabric tape for good measure. Next, it was time to install the cover for the mirror adjustment controls, which is where I ran into my second problem. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the original cover and the blank switch with the new cover. I didn't like how the styling of the new cover had lines going across the front, where the original cover had smooth plastic. To me, this looks like it's clearly an aftermarket edition, and I wanted to keep the original OEM look. More importantly, it turns out that this new cover actually didn't fit the switch assembly on the RAV4 Prime. Here you'll see that when you put the cover on the switch assembly, the little tabs are off by about 1.5 millimeters. Here's a better look with both covers side by side. So I did what any completely normal and not insane person would do. That's right, I broke out my rotary tool and ground down the blanks on my original cover and got it down to the same size as the new cover. The edges weren't perfect, but you can't even tell once it's in the switch assembly. The only thing I wish I would have done differently is been a bit more careful. I ended up with some minor denting in the face of the plastic, but overall not a huge deal. Finally, I reinstalled everything, and now I have fully working power folding mirrors. Thank you for watching.